May 5th, 1945. Hitler had been dead for 5 days. Germany was surrendering. The war in Europe was over in every way that mattered, except in one small Austrian valley, where American soldiers were about to fight their last battle. And they wouldn't be fighting alone. Standing beside them, loading rifles and manning positions in the walls of a medieval castle, were German soldiers, Wehrmacht, the same men they had been trying to kill for 4 years. Their enemy was not each other. Their enemy was the SS, the last true believers, the men who refused to accept that it was over, who were marching through the mountains to execute the prisoners inside that castle before the Americans could reach them. Captain Jack Lee had a choice to make. Trust a German officer he had never met, fight alongside men who had been his enemy that morning, or walk away and let the prisoners die. He had about 30 seconds to decide. This is the story of the strangest battle in American military history. A battle that sounds impossible, a battle that actually happened, and a battle that tells you more about what men are made of than almost anything else from that war. Picture this. High in the Austrian Alps, above a small village called Itter, there is a medieval castle built on a cliff, 700 years old. Stone walls 4 feet thick, a single road leading up to the gate. The Nazis had been using it as a prison since 1943, but not for ordinary prisoners. Castle Itter held what the SS called honor prisoners, people too valuable to kill outright, too dangerous to release. Former prime ministers of France, generals who had fought Germany and lost, a tennis champion, Charles de Gaulle's sister. These were the kind of prisoners you keep as leverage, the kind you execute when leverage is no longer useful. By the first week of May 1945, leverage was running out. The men inside that castle knew what the SS did to prisoners when the war turned against them. They had heard about Dachau, 40 miles away. They had watched their own guards disappear one by one as the Wehrmacht collapsed, some deserting, some surrendering to the advancing Americans, some simply walking away into the mountains. By May 4th, the castle guards were gone entirely. The prisoners were free to walk around the castle. They were not free to leave. SS units controlled every road in the valley below, and some of those units were under orders to ensure that certain high-value prisoners never reached Allied lines alive. Former French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938, stood at a castle window and looked down at the valley. Somewhere down there, help was coming, or it wasn't. He was 72 years old. He had survived 6 years in Nazi custody. He had no way of knowing if anyone was coming, but someone was already on his way. His name was Zvonimir Chuchkovich. He was a Yugoslav handyman who had been living and working at the castle. And on the night of May 3rd, while the last guards were still deserting their posts, he slipped out of the castle with a letter in his pocket. The letter was written in English. It described the castle, the prisoners, and the danger they were in. He walked 40 miles through mountain roads controlled by retreating German forces, through checkpoints and patrols, carrying a letter that would get him shot if anyone read it. He reached Innsbruck the following afternoon. He found American troops. He handed over the letter, and the clock started. While Chuchkovich was making his way to Innsbruck, the prisoners sent a second messenger. Andreas Krobot was the castle's Czech cook. He had a bicycle and a different plan. Instead of heading to Innsbruck, he rode toward the nearest town, Würgl, 8 kilometers down the mountain road. What he found there changed everything. Major Josef Gangl was a decorated German army officer. He had served on the Eastern Front. He had fought for Germany for 6 years. He had watched what the Nazi regime actually was, up close, and somewhere along the way, he had decided he could no longer be part of it. By May 1945, Gangl had quietly made contact with the Austrian resistance. He was using his position, still wearing his Wehrmacht uniform, still technically in command of a small unit of German soldiers, to protect Austrian civilians from SS reprisals. He was playing both sides of a war that was days from ending, trying to ensure that the men under his command survived it. When Krobot found him and described the situation at Castle Itter, Gangl understood immediately what would happen to those prisoners if the SS reached them first. He needed Americans, not because he trusted them. He had been fighting Americans for 4 years, but because he had maybe 20 loyal men, and the SS unit in the valley had 200. He reached out through back channels to the nearest American unit he could locate, and he found Captain John Jack Lee Jr. of the 12th Armored Division. Lee's reaction to a German officer asking for a meeting under a white flag, in the last week of the war, when German units were surrendering by the thousands every day, could have gone several ways. He could have arrested Gangl. He could have ignored him. He could have reported up his chain of command and waited for orders that might take days to arrive. Instead, Lee listened. Gangl explained the situation. He explained who the prisoners were. He explained what the SS intended. And he told Lee something that cut through every calculation about enemies and allies. If they didn't move now, people were going to die in that castle. Lee made his decision. He would go, with whatever men and vehicles he could gather, that night. What Lee assembled that night was not an army. It was one Sherman tank, his own, which his crew had nicknamed Besotten Jenny, a handful of American infantrymen, Gangl and a small number of his Wehrmacht soldiers, and a truck carrying 10 former German artillerymen who had decided, like Gangl, that the war they had been fighting was not worth dying for in its final hours. This was the force that was going to rescue the most important French prisoners in German custody. They moved out in the dark toward Itter. 4 miles from the castle, they ran into an SS roadblock. Not a checkpoint manned by tired men looking to surrender. A deliberate defensive position, men who still believed, men who were prepared to fight. Lee didn't negotiate. Besotten Jenny's 76mm gun settled the argument. They reached the castle on the afternoon of May 4th. The French prisoners came out to meet them, 2 former prime ministers, 2 generals, a tennis champion, a resistance leader, de Gaulle's sister, looking at this small, improbable collection of American and German soldiers with a mixture of relief and alarm. Relief because help had arrived, alarm because there were so few of them. Former General Maxime Weygand, 78 years old, the man who had commanded French forces during the fall of France in 1940, looked at Lee's Sherman tank and the ragged collection of soldiers and said something that was almost admiring in its resignation. Lee set about organizing the defense. The castle was, in one respect, ideal. Stone walls 4 feet thick, a single road to the gate, high ground with clear sight lines. An attacking force would have to come up that road in the open, but Lee had 1 tank, a few dozen men, and limited ammunition. The SS unit in the valley, when it came, was going to bring more than that. He positioned Besotten Jenny at the castle gate. He put riflemen at the windows and on the walls. He organized the French prisoners, some of whom, despite their age, had military experience and insisted on being armed. Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, 66 years old, took a rifle and found a position. Then they waited. That night, the SS came. The morning of May 5th, 1945. 2 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, 5 days after Hitler's death, a war that was over in every capital in the world was not over in this Austrian valley. Oberfuhrer Georg Bockmann led between 100 and 200 Waffen-SS troops out of the tree line and began the assault on Castle Itter. They had an 88mm gun, the same gun that had stopped so many Allied tanks throughout the war. Now it was aimed at the castle gate, where Besotten Jenny was parked. The first shells hit the walls, stone chips and dust. The defenders returned fire. American rifles, German rifles, and 1 Sherman tank, the most unlikely defensive force in the history of the war, held the gate. The 88mm found its mark. Besotten Jenny was hit. The tank caught fire and was knocked out of action. Lee kept fighting on foot. What happened next over the following hours is a story of individual courage that defies the categories of that war. American soldiers fought beside German soldiers. French politicians in their 60s and 70s held rifles at castle windows. A German major who had spent 6 years fighting for a regime he had come to hate stood in the open to protect a man he had never met before yesterday. Major Josef Gangl was killed by a sniper's bullet while shielding former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud from fire. He was 41 years old. He had survived the Eastern Front, the retreat across Europe, and 4 years of a war he had stopped believing in. He died protecting a French politician in an Austrian castle 3 days before the peace. The defenders were running low on ammunition. They needed help, and they needed it fast. Jean Barotra was 66 years old. Before the war, he had been one of the greatest tennis players in the world. A Wimbledon champion, a Davis Cup hero, a man famous for his athleticism and his refusal to quit. Now he was a prisoner in a castle under siege. He volunteered for the mission no one else could do. He would climb the castle wall, drop to the outside, run through SS-controlled ground, find the American relief column that had to be coming and lead them back. Lee looked at a 66-year-old man in civilian clothes and said yes. Barotra went over the wall. He ran. He made it. The relief column from the American 142nd Infantry Regiment arrived at Castle Itter at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The SS broke and ran. Within minutes, it was over. 100 SS soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest fled into the mountains. The defenders came out of the castle. Americans shook hands with Germans. French generals embraced American tank crews. The strangest battle of the war ended as strangely as it had begun, with men who had been enemies standing together in an Austrian courtyard, alive in the last light of a war that had cost the world 50 million lives. The only defender who died was Major Josef Gangl. Austria declared him a national hero. A street in Virgil bears his name. He is remembered there not as a German officer who fought for the wrong side for most of the war, but as a man who made a different choice when it finally mattered. Captain Jack Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest military decorations the United States Army awards. He had gone into that valley with one tank, a handful of men, and a German officer he had met 12 hours earlier. He came out with every prisoner alive. The French prisoners went home. Daladier, Reynaud, Weygand, Gamelin, men who had presided over France's greatest defeat, spent the last years of their lives as free men, in part because an American captain decided to trust a German major in the final hours of a war neither of them wanted any more. The Battle of Castle Itter lasted less than 8 hours. Historians have called it the strangest battle of World War II. The only confirmed instance of American and German soldiers fighting on the same side. The last ground combat operation in the European theater. But what makes it worth remembering is not the strangeness of it. It is what it reveals about the men who fought there. Josef Gangl had spent 6 years in a war he eventually understood was wrong. When the moment came, when he had to decide whether to follow orders or follow his conscience, he chose his conscience. It cost him his life. He died protecting a man he had never met from soldiers fighting under a flag he had once served. Jack Lee was ordered to take his division across Austria as quickly as possible. There were no orders that covered rescue French politicians from a castle with the help of a German defector. He made that decision himself in 30 seconds, based on what he believed was right. And Jean Barotra was 66 years old, a prisoner who had every reason to stay inside the walls. He went over them anyway. Wars are decided by production numbers and industrial capacity and resource allocation, as we have discussed throughout this series. But they are fought by men, individual men making individual decisions in individual moments. What those men did at Castle Itter on May 5, 1945, 3 days before the peace, does not change the outcome of the war. It just tells you something about what the outcome was worth. Next episode, Japan sent 9,000 bombs to the American mainland. Not aircraft, not missiles. Balloons, hydrogen balloons, launched from the Japanese coast, designed to ride the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean and start forest fires in the American West. 9,000 of them were launched. Several hundred reached American soil, and the United States government knew about them and made a decision that is still debated today. They told nobody. The story of Japan's secret balloon bomb campaign, the only Axis attack on the continental United States in World War II, and the government decision that may have made it more deadly, is next.